I'm Roger Evernden. Thank you for inviting me as a keynote speaker at your conference. Many of you here today are involved in or know about Iran's National Enterprise Architecture Framework. I'm going to talk about how architects can move beyond national frameworks so that enterprise architecture can help achieve integration and collaboration across borders. I'll start by giving you a brief overview of this presentation. Many countries have developed or are developing their national enterprise architecture frameworks. But these always exist in a bigger and broader context. So, how should architects position national frameworks in an international context? What do architects need to consider to allow integration, cooperation and collaboration with architectures from other countries? And what do national architecture frameworks need to support our long-term sustainability and survival on this planet? Following this overview, I'll describe the scope of enterprise architecture, the role of government enterprise architectures, why we need integration and collaboration across borders, and the challenges for government enterprise architecture beyond national frameworks. Architecture frameworks have changed significantly in the history of enterprise architecture. I'm going to look at the change in their scope. The scope of enterprise architecture has expanded over the years. For example, the Zachman framework was originally called Information Systems Architecture, a framework. But it was later renamed Enterprise Architecture, a framework, to reflect a scope broader than information technology. When TOGAF, the Open Group Architecture Framework, was created in 1993, it was a technical architecture methodology. The Enterprise edition was only published as TOGAF 8 in 2002. In enterprise architecture terms, an enterprise is defined as a human undertaking or endeavour involving a group of people organised and managed to achieve a purpose. By performing functions and completing activities that depend on the availability of information and supportive technologies. This same basic pattern of business architecture, application and data architecture, and technology or infrastructure architecture is repeated across almost every enterprise architecture today. A variation on this pattern is found in Iran's National Enterprise Architecture Framework. Here, the enterprise is the government as a whole or individual agencies. Each enterprise has an organisation or management layer which is comprised of 4 common high-level architecture domains and the security domain. But with the advance of the internet, digital technologies and globalization, more and more of the components used by each individual enterprise exist beyond the traditional boundary of a national government or agency. These components are outside the direct control of a government enterprise architecture team. They are part of a generic, environmental context that determines the structure and behaviour of the human-made systems in the broadest sense. What does this mean for government enterprise architecture? And how will this change national frameworks? As we've seen, most architecture frameworks are based on the same basic architectural pattern, which is usually presented as a series of horizontal layers and vertical pillars. But this pattern doesn't adequately reflect the dependencies between architecture components that are genuinely national and components that exist in the broader environmental or social context. It's time to rethink the basic architectural pattern adopted by so many architecture frameworks. The crucial point is to decide which components and responsibilities remain within the traditional boundary of enterprise or government, and which need to be shared by the broader community. I'll come back to this pattern later, but for now I'll summarise the key points for the future evolution of architecture frameworks. Although our discipline will probably continue to be known as enterprise architecture, increasingly it will cover the architecture of any human-designed system, which includes all social, political, economic, environmental and cultural organisms, in addition to the domains we currently expect to find in enterprise architecture. Enterprises and governments will need to rethink governance of their enterprise architecture. Before I examine the international role of enterprise architecture, I want to briefly examine the current role of government enterprise architecture. Ultimately, government enterprise architecture is about achieving better governance of a nation through a cohesive, planned and integrated set of components that leverage a wide range of modern technologies. The key benefits in applying enterprise architecture at a government level are the same as for most enterprises: to improve interoperability, to reduce costs, and to avoid duplicated effort. In most nations, there's a considerable gap between government today and the potential for integrated and effective government systems in the future. Enterprise architecture is really good at translating concerns into a clear description of the architecture, explaining the constraints inherent in the current environment and developing options for transforming it. Most developed and many developing countries are either considering or using national or government-wide enterprise architecture. Well-known examples include those in the USA, Australia, Singapore, or Canada. Research and experience show that government enterprise architecture schemes do make a positive difference at a national level. But as with other types of enterprise, many components that are vital for an individual government exist beyond its national boundary. Why does this matter? And what can architects do? Firstly, why do we need integration and collaboration across international borders? I'll discuss two reasons, one based on the driving forces and one based around sound enterprise architecture practice. There are a set of driving forces that are vital concerns which face all national governments. We all live in a massively interconnected world where trade and economies interact with and depend on each other. We don't know if today's population of 7 billion is sustainable or what the limit is. In addition, inequalities and changes in the global economy are causing crises with migration and refugees. The natural resources on our planet are limited and becoming more scarce. But again, many of these resources need to be shared by all nations, which requires collaboration across global economic systems. The constant drive to expand economies, to feed growing populations, and to exploit resources are just three international forces leading to disasters in our natural environment caused by human activity. Finally, terrorism and conflict are no longer local or regional concerns. Threats can only be anticipated and avoided through international cooperation. These driving forces, and others, can only be understood and addressed at the architectural level of understanding. So how do we understand at the architectural level? The Open Group Architecture Framework, or TOGAF, describes the enterprise continuum, which is divided into the architecture and solutions continua. Each continuum runs from generic to specific. We separate architecture from solutions because architectural thinking adds insight and understanding. We separate generic from specific to leverage shared knowledge and communal components. In the Open Group Architecture Framework, or TOGAF, the enterprise continuum separates architecture from solutions, but experience suggests that there are 4 levels of understanding. The 4 levels of understanding range from the architectural level, through the solution or design level, and the development or implementation level, to the operational or systems level. Each level provides a different understanding of the real world. Each level has its own distinctive methodologies and techniques. Each level is valuable and useful. And it's only in the interaction between all of these levels that we gain the knowledge and insights to address the deepest and most complex issues that face governments today. In particular, we need to think at each level of understanding if we are to address the really big worldwide concerns and drivers. We also share knowledge about each of these levels on a spectrum that ranges from the highly generic or fundamental to segments within an enterprise. For example, there are many industry architectures that are shared by all companies operating in the same industry sector, such as financial services, telecommunications, or utilities. To address contemporary needs in government, architects need to go beyond national frameworks by extending and leveraging the concept of an enterprise continuum as defined in the Open Group Architecture Framework, or TOGAF. Explicitly expanding the architecture and solutions continua into 4 levels of understanding makes it easier to share and learn from insights at every level. And introducing additional levels of responsibility along the spectrum from generic to specific makes the task of architecting easier by reusing components and concepts that should be shared. But leveraging the insights from all 4 levels of understanding and expanding generic specific responsibilities will work much better if we also rethink the domain pattern that I described earlier. A lot of infrastructure components are now developed and managed beyond the direct control of government enterprise architecture teams. For example, the Internet platform and its protocols and standards. There are many infrastructure components that could be shared beyond national frameworks. One example of an initiative to shift concepts and components from national frameworks to international frameworks is the European Interoperability Framework. But architecture specifications and components from other domains should also be shared when they're truly generic. The important point is to define the separation of domains and their layers or pillars so that they reflect the needs of your government and its need to connect with architectures in the wider community and environment. Having the right pattern is important. It determines how you think about your government enterprise architecture, and more importantly, it determines its success and effectiveness. I've given some of the reasons why it's so important to think beyond national frameworks. So what are the key challenges for government enterprise architecture? The commonly used source frameworks, such as the Open Group Architecture Framework, TOGAF, or ZACMAN, do not explain how to leverage or integrate architecture frameworks, which requires more advanced enterprise architecture techniques. For example, expanding the enterprise architecture meta-model to include environmental issues and broader international concerns and drivers. Using a meta-framework and multiple integrated architecture frameworks to guide discussions and manage change. Or developing strategic vector charts to provide direction, leadership, and guide synergistic investments around strategic themes. And the levels of architectural understanding and shared generic responsibilities are key techniques for achieving integration and collaboration beyond national frameworks. At the same time, architects need to develop new capabilities within their enterprise architecture practice to build interoperability beyond national frameworks, to debate and understand all critical decisions at the architectural level, to educate key stakeholders to have realistic expectations about the value and benefits of enterprise architecture, and above all, to leverage the potential in the enterprise continuum and meta framework. I've shown how the scope of enterprise architecture is necessarily extended beyond traditional enterprise and national boundaries, and explained some of the reasons why government enterprise architecture initiatives will need to collaborate and integrate through international architecture frameworks. Finally, I've outlined some of the challenges facing architects and researchers working on public sector architectures. This is an exciting time for those of you working in government enterprise architecture. Thank you for watching.